They say vindication tastes sweet, but when it comes at the cost of your company's entire customer database, it's more like chewing glass while your house burns down. My name is Maria Jameson, and I've been NorTech Senior Cybersecurity Analyst for 3 years. 3 years of watching our digital infrastructure held together by duct tape and prayer, while I drafted proposal after proposal for comprehensive security overhauls. The office smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and unfulfilled potential, a fitting metaphor for our approach to data protection. NorTech prided itself on being a lean, agile startup that had somehow grown into a mid-sized company without shedding its cavalier attitude toward risk management. We handled sensitive client data for over 200 companies across the healthcare and finance sectors. The kind of data that, if compromised, could ruin lives and end careers. Our client roster read like a who's who of organizations you'd least want to see on the evening news: Riverside Medical Group with their 50,000 patient records, First National Credit Union's loan portfolios, and Greenfield Insurance's claims database. Each contract came with compliance requirements thick as phone books, HIPAA, SOX, PCI DSS, regulations that demanded security measures we simply didn't have in place. The irony was suffocating. We'd built our reputation on being the trusted partner for companies that couldn't afford their own robust IT departments. They came to us because we promised enterprise-level security at startup prices. What they got was startup-level security with enterprise-level risk. I'd been working on a comprehensive cybersecurity framework for months. Late nights turned into early mornings as I mapped out vulnerabilities, designed multi-layered defense systems, and calculated risk assessments that would have made actuaries weep. The framework wasn't just thorough, it was elegant. A digital fortress that could adapt and evolve with emerging threats. The framework consisted of 7 core components: endpoint detection and response systems, network segmentation protocols, zero-trust architecture implementation, automated threat intelligence feeds, incident response procedures, employee security training programs, and compliance monitoring dashboards. Each component was designed to work in harmony with the others, creating overlapping layers of protection that would make penetration about as likely as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. I'd spent countless hours researching similar implementations at companies like ours. The success stories were compelling. TechFlow reduced their security incidents by 89% after implementing a comparable framework. DataVault eliminated credential-based attacks entirely. Even smaller companies like Nexus Solutions had seen dramatic improvements in their security posture within 6 months of deployment. The cost-benefit analysis was crystal clear. The initial investment would pay for itself within 2 years through reduced insurance premiums, avoided breach costs, and improved client retention. I'd even identified 3 vendors who could provide volume discounts if we committed to a multi-year contract. But perhaps most importantly, the framework would have given us something we desperately lacked: visibility. At that moment, we were essentially flying blind through a thunderstorm. We had no real-time monitoring, no automated alerts, no way to detect if someone had already breached our perimeter and was quietly copying our clients' most sensitive information. When I finally presented it to Director Benjamin Cross, I felt like an architect unveiling blueprints for a cathedral. The conference room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I walked through each component, explaining how our current system was essentially a screen door on a submarine. Benjamin Cross was the kind of executive who'd risen through the ranks by being in the right place at the right time, with just enough technical knowledge to be dangerous and just enough charisma to be convincing. He'd joined NorTech 18 months ago from a consulting firm where he'd specialized in digital transformation, a phrase that in his vocabulary seemed to mean moving fast and breaking things, preferably other people's things. He had a corner office decorated with motivational posters featuring rock climbers and race cars, each emblazoned with inspirational text about pushing boundaries and embracing disruption. The irony of having a poster about calculated risks while systematically avoiding any actual risk calculation was lost on him entirely. During my presentation, I watched his attention drift like a tourist in a museum. His eyes would focus briefly on my slides, then wander to his phone, then to the window, then back to my slides with the guilty jump of someone who'd been caught not paying attention in church. Benjamin listened with the attention span of a goldfish at a laser light show. Halfway through my presentation, he started checking his phone. By the time I reached the implementation timeline, he was openly scrolling through social media. "Maria," he said, not looking up from his screen, "this is all very comprehensive. But we're not the Pentagon. We're a tech company. Paranoia slows innovation." The words hit me like a slap delivered with a smile. 3 months of work, dismissed with a joke and a tech bro platitude. I could feel my carefully prepared response dissolving into something more primal. Benjamin, with respect, we're handling medical records, financial data, and personal information for over 200 clients. If we're breached, we'll deal with it, he interrupted, waving his hand as if shooing away a fly. But right now, we need to focus on scaling. We've got 3 major client presentations next week, and the development team is already stretched thin with the new product launch. His dismissal was so casual, so effortless, that I almost admired it. Here was a man who could wave away months of research and risk assessment with the same energy most people use to decline a newsletter subscription. The framework could be implemented in phases, I tried again, hearing the note of desperation creeping into my voice. We could start with just the endpoint detection systems and... Maria. His voice took on the patronizing tone that middle management reserves for explaining why good ideas are actually bad ideas. I appreciate your thoroughness, really. But we're not in the business of building Fort Knox. We're in the business of moving fast and staying competitive. The meeting ended with him standing up and straightening his tie, as if he'd just concluded a successful negotiation rather than dismissing a critical security initiative. He shook my hand, and told me to think about how we can optimize our current systems instead of rebuilding from scratch. I stared at him across the conference table, my carefully prepared talking points dissolving into white noise. Benjamin, we're handling sensitive data for... I know what we're handling, he interrupted, finally looking up. And I know what our priorities are. We need to focus on growth, not building digital bunkers. File your report, but we're not implementing any of this right now. The dismissal was clinical, efficient. Like being fired by a productivity app. I spent the next week in a professional purgatory, watching our systems with the helpless awareness of someone watching a drunk person juggle lit torches. Every login felt like a gamble. Every data transfer was a game of Russian roulette with our clients' most sensitive information. The worst part wasn't the professional frustration, it was the knowledge that I was complicit in a system I knew was fundamentally broken. Every day I came to work, I was implicitly agreeing that our clients' data was worth protecting just enough to meet the bare minimum regulatory requirements, but not enough to actually secure it properly. I started having dreams about data breaches. Not nightmares, exactly, but those anxiety dreams where you're trying to fix something that keeps breaking faster than you can repair it. I'd wake up with my heart racing, immediately reaching for my phone to check our monitoring systems for alerts that our bare-bones setup probably wouldn't even generate. My colleagues noticed my mood. Trevor from IT joked that I looked like I was attending my own funeral. Amanda from HR asked if I needed to talk to someone about stress management. Even the custodial staff started giving me concerned looks. Trevor was particularly observant. He'd been at NorTech for 5 years, long enough to have seen multiple security scares that were quietly swept under the rug. During our coffee breaks, he'd share stories about mysterious network slowdowns that nobody wanted to investigate too closely, about client complaints that were attributed to system maintenance rather than potential intrusions. You know what I don't understand, he said one afternoon, stirring his coffee with the intensity of someone mixing rocket fuel. We spend more on the office coffee machine than we do on intrusion detection. That espresso maker in the break room? $3,000. Our entire security monitoring setup? Maybe half that. The observation was so absurd it was almost funny. Almost. Amanda from HR had a different perspective. She'd joined NorTech from a larger corporation where security protocols were treated like religious doctrine. The contrast was jarring for her. At my last job, we had mandatory security training every quarter, she told me. Here, I can't even get approval for a basic phishing simulation. Benjamin says it would undermine trust in our email systems. The logic was mind-bending. We couldn't test our employees' ability to recognize phishing attempts because discovering that they couldn't recognize phishing attempts might make them worried about phishing attempts. But what could I say? That I'd identified critical vulnerabilities and been told to file them away like expired warranties? That our security was held together by good intentions and SSL certificates that hadn't been updated since the Obama administration? I did what any reasonable person would do, I documented everything. Every vulnerability, every risk assessment, every recommendation that had been shelved. I created a digital paper trail that would make archaeologists proud, knowing that someday, someone would need to understand how we'd arrived at whatever disaster was inevitably coming. The documentation became my obsession. I created detailed vulnerability assessments for each of our client-facing systems. I mapped out attack vectors that kept me awake at night. I calculated the potential financial impact of various breach scenarios, creating spreadsheets that read like disaster movie scripts. One particularly haunting analysis focused on our client database server. The machine was running software that was 2 major versions behind current security patches. It had direct internet connectivity despite containing the most sensitive data in our entire organization. The access logs showed connection attempts from IP addresses in countries we definitely didn't do business with. In my framework presentation, I'd identified this server as priority 1 for immediate remediation. In Benjamin's response, it had been categorized as functioning adequately for current needs. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was creating documentation for a postmortem while the patient was still breathing. During this period, I also started paying closer attention to our competitors. DataShield, our biggest rival, had just announced a major security certification that was helping them win contracts we'd been pursuing. Their marketing materials prominently featured their military-grade security infrastructure and proactive threat detection capabilities. Meanwhile, our marketing materials focused on lean efficiency and agile responsiveness. We were essentially advertising our lack of security as a feature, positioning our vulnerabilities as selling points for clients who wanted to move fast and break things. The competitive landscape was shifting beneath our feet, but Benjamin seemed oblivious to the change. He was still operating under the assumption that security was a cost center rather than a competitive advantage. He couldn't see that our clients were starting to ask harder questions about data protection, driven by increasingly frequent news stories about breaches and regulatory fines. I started collecting those news stories, building a database of security incidents that had befallen companies similar to ours. The patterns were depressingly predictable: initial denial, followed by gradual revelation of the scope of the breach, followed by expensive remediation efforts, followed by lawsuits and regulatory penalties, followed by executive resignations and organizational restructuring. Each story felt like a preview of coming attractions. 2 weeks after my framework was shelved, I was deep in routine maintenance when Benjamin's office door exploded open like he'd been shot from a cannon. He burst into the main workspace, his usually pristine polo shirt wrinkled, sweat beading on his forehead like he'd just finished a marathon in a sauna. "Maria." His voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. "Why didn't you implement your fix?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a burning building. Around us, the office fell silent except for the persistent hum of servers and the distant sound of someone's keyboard clicking frantically. The transformation was remarkable. The same man who dismissed my framework with casual indifference was now standing in front of me looking like he'd seen his own obituary. His confident executive demeanor had been replaced by something approaching panic, tinged with the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, I'd ignored his direct instructions and implemented the security measures anyway. I could see Trevor in my peripheral vision, his head popped up over his cubicle wall like a prairie dog sensing danger. Amanda had stopped pretending to work and was openly watching the unfolding drama. Even the sales team had gone quiet, their usual phone chatter replaced by the kind of expectant silence that precedes either a celebration or a funeral. I looked up from my workstation, where I'd been monitoring network traffic, our perfectly functional, completely vulnerable network traffic. "Which fix would that be, Benjamin?" The question was loaded with 3 months of accumulated frustration, 2 weeks of professional vindication, and just enough professional courtesy to avoid an immediate HR complaint. I knew exactly what fix he meant. He knew I knew. But I wanted to hear him say it. His face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a color that could charitably be called panicked salmon. "The security framework. The one you presented. Why isn't it running?" The beautiful thing about documentation is that it doesn't lie. I opened my laptop and pulled up the meeting notes from 2 weeks prior. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The notes were meticulous, clinical, and absolutely devastating. "According to my records," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hands, "the cybersecurity framework was deemed unnecessary. You said, and I quote, 'Paranoia slows innovation.' The recommendation was to file the report and focus on growth initiatives." I could have stopped there. Professional courtesy suggested I should have stopped there. But 3 months of late nights and the growing certainty that we were heading for disaster had eroded my capacity for diplomatic restraint. "You also mentioned that we're not the Pentagon," I continued, "and that we should focus on moving fast and staying competitive rather than building digital bunkers. Would you like me to read the full transcript of our meeting?" The offer was rhetorical, but Benjamin's expression suggested he was seriously considering whether hearing his own words read back to him would make the situation better or worse. Benjamin's expression shifted from panic to something approaching existential dread. But you could have implemented it anyway, right? As a precaution? The question revealed so much about his understanding of organizational hierarchy, professional accountability, and basic workplace dynamics that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, not the triumphant grin of vindication, but the weary smile of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. I could have, I said. But that would have been insubordination. And as you mentioned, we're not the Pentagon. The callback was petty, but after 3 months of professionally swallowing my frustration, a little pettiness felt like a small act of justice. Besides, I continued, implementing the framework would have required budget approval, vendor contracts, and coordination with multiple departments. None of which were authorized after our meeting. What I didn't say was that I'd actually started the preliminary work anyway. I'd reached out to 3 vendors for updated quotes, begun drafting implementation schedules, and even started preparing training materials for the rest of the team. Not because I thought Benjamin would change his mind, but because I knew that when the inevitable happened, we'd need to move fast. The preliminary work was sitting in a folder on my desktop labeled Emergency Response Plans. It was my insurance policy against the disaster I could see coming from miles away. Benjamin ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that made him look less like a competent executive and more like a man trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while the building burned down around him. How long would it take to implement now? The full framework? 6 to 8 weeks, assuming we can get vendor cooperation and budget approval. What about a partial implementation? Just the critical components? I pretended to consider this, even though I'd already run the calculations. The endpoint detection systems could be deployed in 72 hours. Network segmentation would take about a week. The monitoring dashboard could be operational in 48 hours if we expedite the vendor setup. Do it, he said, with the decisive tone of someone who'd just realized his house was on fire. All of it. Whatever you need. The transformation was complete. The same man who dismissed my framework as unnecessary paranoia was now authorizing its implementation with the urgency of someone calling 911. The next 6 hours unfolded like a disaster movie played in slow motion. Benjamin disappeared into his office with the IT leadership team, their voices carrying through the walls in increasingly frantic whispers. Phone calls were made to lawyers, insurance companies, and what I assumed were very expensive crisis management consultants. The office atmosphere shifted from normal workplace bustle to the kind of tense quiet that accompanies natural disasters. People spoke in hushed tones, gathered in small groups, and kept glancing toward Benjamin's office like it might explode at any moment. Trevor appeared at my desk around lunchtime, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a car accident. So, he said, settling into the chair next to my workstation, I'm hearing some interesting rumors about why Benjamin looked like he'd seen a ghost. I accepted the coffee gratefully. What kind of rumors? The kind that involve 3-letter government agencies and very expensive lawyers, he said, lowering his voice to a whisper. Janet from accounting got a call from our cyber insurance company. They're sending an incident response team. The news hit me like a punch to the stomach. Cyber insurance incident response teams don't get called for minor security hiccups. They get called for the kind of breaches that make headlines and end careers. How bad is it? I asked. Trevor shrugged, but his expression was grim. Bad enough that they're talking about notifying clients. Bad enough that Benjamin's been on the phone with the CEO for the past hour. By 5 p.m., the official story began to crystallize. We'd experienced a minor security incident that was being actively addressed by our world-class IT team. The language was so sanitized it could have been used in an operating room. The reality was less pristine. Our main database had been compromised through a vulnerability I'd identified in my shelved framework. The attackers had been inside our systems for over a week, leisurely copying client data like tourists photographing monuments. The breach had been discovered not by our non-existent monitoring systems, but by a client whose own security team had noticed suspicious activity originating from our IP address. They'd called to ask why we were accessing their systems at 3 a.m. on a Sunday from a server in Eastern Europe. The call triggered a frantic investigation. Patient records, financial data, insurance claims, all stolen and now sitting on foreign servers beyond legal reach. The breach originated from a SQL injection in our client portal, the same flaw I'd flagged in my framework. The attackers used basic tools to move through our network undetected for 9 days, copying everything and planting backdoors. The assessment? We were thoroughly compromised by amateurs exploiting unlocked doors. Then came Trevor's text, "They want your framework." All of it. Protocols once deemed overkill were suddenly urgent fixes. By week's end, the breach hit the press. Clients asked questions I'd asked months ago. Benjamin avoided eye contact, sensing the fallout. 3 weeks later, I was promoted to Senior Director of Cybersecurity. I accepted, not for revenge, but to rebuild. My dismissed framework became the foundation of a full overhaul. The breach cost $2 million. My plan would have cost $300,000. The real danger? Saying, "That's not necessary right now." To others in security, document everything. Integrity matters. Being right doesn't always feel like a win until it prevents disaster.